What if I told you that one cold night in the Yorkshire Valley, a quiet man and his faithful husky faced a darkness meant to destroy them, but something greater stood by their side, a battle against fear, a fight for home, and a miracle that arrived when hope seemed lost. This is the story of Thomas and Frost, a reminder that courage can rise from broken places, and that sometimes God sends his angels in the form of loyal friends with blue eyes and a warrior's heart. If their journey touches your soul, don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe for more stories of faith, hope, and quiet miracles. Thomas Walker walked the narrow dirt path that cut through the heather fields behind his cottage, the soles of his old work boots whispering across the frosted ground. At 48, he carried the weary grace of a man who had spent more years in hardship than in peace. He stood a bit over 6 feet tall, lean yet solid, the kind of wiry strength forged by years of lifting engine parts and working under cold metal hulls. His shoulders were slightly rounded from old injuries, ghosts from his time as an army mechanic, and his left knee carried a stiffness that never quite faded after the explosion that ended his military career. His hair, once a dark brown, had begun to gray at the temples, streaked with the fatigued silver of too many sleepless nights. A rough stubble shadowed his jawline, not for style, but because mornings were often battles of their own, and shaving rarely made the list. His skin bore the pale, wind-worn texture of someone who worked outdoors through every season, and his eyes, an introspective shade of steel blue, held a quiet vigilance that never truly rested. Life, in all its cruelty and stubbornness, had carved sharp corners into Thomas, but beneath them lived a tenderness he tried, and often failed, to hide. Padding beside him with rhythmic certainty was Frost, a Siberian husky with a coat like winter itself. Frost was large for his breed, around 4 years old, with thick fur of deep charcoal and bright white, the colors blending like swirling snow on a nighttime ridge. His ice-blue eyes were arresting, almost mystical, carrying a depth that made strangers think twice before approaching. Yet with Thomas, Frost moved with soft devotion, nudging his hand occasionally, brushing his flank against Thomas's leg, listening for every subtle shift in his tone. Thomas had rescued him from a rundown animal shelter 2 winters ago, a place where Frost had been left by a family unprepared for the demands of a working dog. But Thomas had seen something different in those pale eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. Saving Frost had felt less like an act of charity and more like 2 damaged souls recognizing each other across the divide. Thomas's cottage came into view as the fog thickened, turning the horizon into a watercolor of muted shapes. It was a small, weathered home with faded blue shutters and a roof patched in places with corrugated steel. The house had belonged to his parents, and then to him, by default rather than choice. Memories lived in every floorboard, his father chopping wood in the icy dawn, his mother humming as she baked bread, the warmth of laughter that once echoed inside. Now it was just Thomas and Frost, sharing a space that felt too big for a life reduced to essentials. Still, this cottage was the last thing Thomas owned that tied him to a world where he had once felt loved, and he clung to it with a quiet desperation. As they neared the property line, Frost lifted his head, ears pricking. His steps slowed. A low rumble started in his chest. Thomas felt the shift instantly. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, stopping beside him. Frost didn't bark. He rarely did unless the situation warranted it. But he positioned himself slightly ahead of Thomas, tail stiff, posture alert. Thomas followed Frost's gaze, squinting through the fog. 3 figures stood near the old stone fence that lined the cottage yard. Young men, early 20s by Thomas's guess, each wrapped in cheap leather jackets and the smug, careless energy of people who had never been held accountable for the damage they caused. Their shapes were shadowed in the mist, but even at a distance, Thomas recognized their posture, entitled, unwelcoming, and predatory. The one in the middle stepped forward, and the fog peeled back just enough to reveal his face, Ethan Briggs. At 23, he had the build of someone who thought himself tougher than he was, medium height, stocky, with sandy hair shaved close on the sides and longer on top. His expression carried a constant smirk, the kind that suggested he enjoyed watching others suffer. Ethan's father owned the local construction firm, rumored to be interested in buying land around the valley for development. Thomas had rejected every offer. Ethan waved lazily. "Evening, Walker." Thomas stopped a few yards away, Frost pressing close against his thigh. Thomas rested a hand lightly on Frost's back, steadying him and himself. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, voice flat but firm. Ethan gestured broadly toward the cottage, as if unveiling a prize on display. "Just thought we'd check in and see if you've come to your senses about selling. Dad says he's ready to make a final offer. Generous, mind you." "I'm not selling," Thomas replied, before the sentence was finished. His voice was low, but carried the weight of something unmovable. One of Ethan's companions, a lanky boy with a sharp nose and blotchy complexion, snorted. "Why hang on to this dump anyway? Could get a fresh start somewhere else." Thomas's jaw tightened. The house may have looked like a dump to them, but to him it was a sanctuary held together not by nails and wood, but by memory and promise. "I said no." Ethan's smirk hardened at the edges. He stepped closer, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, chin raised with practiced arrogance. "See, that's the thing. No one else in this valley seems to appreciate what the company's offering, but you're making things difficult." Thomas felt the old instinct rising, military training pushing itself through layers of civilian restraint. His muscles coiled subtly, breath steadying, eyes narrowing just enough to read the room. Frost sensed it too. His teeth barely flashed in the dim light as he released a quiet growl. Ethan's eyes flicked to the Husky. "That mutt of yours gonna bite?" he taunted. "He's not a mutt," Thomas replied, his voice now edged with steel. "And he only bites when he has a reason." The lanky boy picked up a loose stone and tossed it from hand to hand. "Careful, Walker. Wouldn't want Frost here to disappear one night." Thomas felt a cold surge travel down his spine. Not fear, but something far sharper. Protectiveness igniting like struck flint. Frost was more than a pet. He was Thomas's anchor, his solace, the one creature that reminded him he was still capable of love. Losing Frost would be losing the last piece of himself he still believed in. "You touch him," Thomas said quietly, dangerously quiet, "and you'll answer for it." Ethan laughed, though the sound wavered. "Relax, old man, we're just talking. But seriously, Dad expects an answer soon. Might not be so polite next time." With that, Ethan jerked his head at the others, and the trio disappeared into the fog as quickly as they had appeared. For a long moment, Thomas and Frost remained still, letting the valley settle back into its muted hush. Thomas exhaled slowly, but his pulse continued to throb at the base of his neck. He hated confrontation. Years of military service had drained any appetite for aggression, but some things demanded a stand. And this land, these memories, Frost. They were all he had left. As he walked toward the cottage, Frost remained close, eyes scanning the path, ears still pivoting as though expecting the men to return. Thomas reached down and brushed the top of Frost's head. "Not today, boy," he whispered. "They're gone for now." But even as he said it, he knew in his gut that the evening marked the beginning of something darker. Ethan Briggs didn't approach people casually, and threats like that were rarely empty. Someone wanted the land badly enough to send thugs, and Thomas had just made himself an obstacle. Inside the cottage, Thomas lit a single lamp, its glow casting warm amber shadows across the small living room. Frost curled at his feet, but his eyes remained open, watchful. Thomas sat heavily into the old armchair that used to be his father's, the smell of worn leather enveloping him in memories. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion seep into his bones. His thoughts drifted, first to the fog outside, then to the faces of the young men, then to the past he tried so hard to leave buried. He remembered the explosion, the sharp ringing in his ears, the smoke curling into the sky like a serpent of flame. He remembered carrying 2 wounded soldiers to safety before collapsing, his knee shattered. He remembered the guilt that followed him home, the faint echoes of camaraderie that haunted him in empty rooms. The world had moved on, but Thomas remained anchored to old grief, unable or unwilling to drift free. Frost shifted, placing his head on Thomas's boot. The gesture, a quiet, grounding weight, pulled Thomas back into the moment. "You're a good lad," he murmured, stroking Frost's fur. Outside, the valley was swallowed by fog once more, but this time, the mist felt different, no longer a gentle veil of evening, but a warning, a sign that tensions were gathering like storm clouds behind the hills. Thomas stared into the dim light, knowing with a sinking heaviness that the peace he fought to maintain was slipping further from his grasp. Tonight, he had merely been threatened, but threats, he knew, had a way of turning into battles. And battles? Those had a way of demanding everything a man had left. The storm clouds gathered over the Yorkshire Valley long before the first drop of rain ever touched the earth, swelling like a bruise across the sky, as if nature itself sensed the unrest growing around Thomas Walker's quiet life. Evening descended in a heavy shroud, the wind pushing through the heather fields in low, mournful sighs, bending the grass in rippling waves. Thomas stood on the front step of his cottage, Frost pressed close beside him, both staring into the dim stretch of land that separated the home from the road. There was a tightness in Thomas's chest, a kind of pressure that felt eerily familiar, as if echoing the tense anticipation he'd known in military deployments overseas. Something was shifting in the air. Frost knew it too. The Husky's posture was stiff, his thick winter coat bristling slightly, ears drawn forward in intense focus. His icy blue eyes narrowed toward the horizon, scanning the growing darkness. Thomas knelt, his sore knee protesting with a sharp pinch. He placed a hand on Frost's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the dense fur. "Easy, lad," he murmured, but the words brought him no comfort. He had seen animals behave like this before, when danger prowled just beyond the line of sight. And danger, he suspected, had a name: Graham Doyle. The first time Thomas had heard that name had been the same night Ethan Briggs and his cronies threatened him. They'd thrown it around casually, as if, simply speaking, it was enough to make the valley tremble. Graham was the shadow behind the construction company interested in the land, a figure known only in rumors. Unlike Ethan's bluster, Graham Doyle had a reputation built on quiet cruelty. People in the village claimed he inherited his father's business and his father's ruthlessness, though exaggerated tales made him sound more specter than man. Still, the next morning proved Graham's existence all too real. Thomas woke to find his shed door hanging loose, the latch split clean down the grain. Inside, tools lay scattered and stomped into the dirt floor. His late father's hammer snapped in two, a lifetime's worth of wrenches and parts tossed like trash. Frost had barked at sunrise, pacing in tight, anxious circles until Thomas stepped outside to discover the damage. On the shed wall, written in black spray paint, were 3 words: "Sell the land." Thomas stood staring at the letters for a long time. His breath came shallow, frost curling from his lips. The destruction cut deeper than mere vandalism. It was a desecration of legacy. His father had crafted each shelf with careful hands, had organized tools by size and purpose, had taught Thomas what each one did. Those quiet afternoons spent learning how to repair engines and mend broken metal were sacred memories, the kind that held him together when grief threatened to tear him apart. Now, the place looked like a battlefield. Frost nudged Thomas's hand, sensing the storm. Inside his chest, Thomas swallowed hard. "We're not giving in," he whispered, voice shaking just barely. "Not now, not ever." Later that day, after repairing what he could and securing the shed with extra boards, Thomas found an envelope shoved beneath the cottage door. No postage, no handwriting on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed, impersonal, cold: "Final warning, sell or we take everything." G.D. Thomas stared at the initials, feeling heat pulse beneath his skin. He had faced death before, real death, on real front lines. But fear was rarely logical. It crept into quiet places, making a man question his strength. He had survived a war, but now he wondered if he could survive losing the only things he had left: his home, his memories, Frost. He folded the paper and tucked it deep inside a drawer he rarely opened. Frost watched with sharp curiosity, then settled by the door, curling his tail around his paws like a sentinel guarding the threshold. Days passed. The threats didn't stop. Every night, Frost lay across the front door, sometimes sleeping lightly, sometimes awake entirely, ears twitching with every shift of the wind. Thomas often woke to the sound of him growling low, a sound that trembled deep in his chest. When Thomas would sit beside him, Frost pressed his cold nose into Thomas's palm, as if urging him not to open the door. One afternoon, while Thomas was patching a leak on the cottage's back window, a woman approached the property, someone he had never seen before. Her presence startled him, though she carried no hostility in her stride. She looked to be around Thomas's age, perhaps a little younger, mid-40s, tall and slender, with the lithe posture of someone accustomed to long walks. She had auburn hair streaked with early gray, tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and her face was soft but lined by worry. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled, and her green eyes held a kind of brightness that suggested she was used to taking care of others, even when her own life frayed at the edges. She stopped a respectful distance away, offering a tentative smile. "Mr. Walker?" Thomas lowered his hammer but didn't approach. Frost stood beside him, tail stiff, posture protective. "That's me," Thomas answered. "My name is Margaret Hale," she said, clasping her hands before her. She had a gentle voice, though worry trembled beneath it. "I live about a mile down the road. I heard, well, everyone heard, about the trouble with the Briggs boys." She glanced toward Frost, her smile warming. "He's a handsome lad." Thomas softened a little. "He knows it too." Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to check on you. It's been years since anyone bothered with folks up this way, but this feels wrong. People talk. They say Graham Doyle's behind it." Her voice lowered. "And when he sets his eyes on something, he doesn't let go." Thomas studied her more closely. Her hands had faint scars, thin white lines that suggested years of gardening or labor. There was a quiet strength to her, though her anxiety was clear. She wasn't there to pry, only to warn. "I appreciate the thought," Thomas said gently. "But I'll manage." She looked like she wanted to argue, but Frost stepped between them, sniffing her shoes before relaxing slightly. That earned her a sliver of trust. "Well," she said softly, "if you need anything, even just someone to keep watch for a night or two, you know where I am." Thomas nodded, filing away her offer with a gratitude he didn't voice aloud. After she left, he noticed Frost watching her walk down the dirt path, alert, yet no longer bristling. Animals knew character better than people did. Still, kindness couldn't stop what came next. The storm arrived on a night already tense with silence. Rain battered the roof in uneven bursts, thunder rolling across the valley like distant artillery. The wind hit the cottage at sharp angles, rattling the windows and making the old shutters slap against the walls. Thomas sat at the table, repairing a lantern wick when Frost suddenly rose, tail erect, ears pointing like arrows toward the door. "What now?" Thomas whispered. Frost moved to the door, circling once before planting himself firmly in front of it. His body blocked the entrance entirely, hackles raised, a deep rumbling growl vibrating through the floorboards. Thomas stood slowly, his injured knee sending a jolt of pain up his thigh. Outside, the storm howled, but something else moved beneath it, a low hum, a mechanical murmur barely audible over the rain. Headlights. They swept briefly across the far field, then disappeared. No one should be out in weather like this unless they had purpose. And Thomas doubted this purpose was good. He approached the door, hand hovering over the handle, but Frost snapped, not at him, but at the movement itself, nudging his leg forcefully, as if to say, "Don't." Thomas froze, startled. Frost had never pushed him before. "All right," Thomas whispered, stepping back. "All right, lad, I trust you." They moved to the window instead. From behind the curtain's edge, Thomas peered into the storm. A dark vehicle, large, boxy, with tinted windows, crept slowly along the muddy road by the property line. It wasn't a villager's car. It was too clean, too modern, too intentional. The vehicle paused near his fence, stopped. The beams of its headlights flickered off for just a moment, enough for someone to step out, survey the area, then return. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't vandalism. This was reconnaissance. Someone was planning something bigger, something crueler, darker, more permanent. He placed his hand on Frost's back, feeling the dog's muscles tight with tension. "We're in it now," Thomas whispered. "The real fight's begun." Outside, the storm raged louder, as if the valley itself cried a warning. But Thomas Walker did not back down, not from war, not from grief, not from darkness, and certainly not from men who thought they could steal the last piece of his life without a fight. The wind cut sharply across the Yorkshire moors that late afternoon, carrying with it the lingering scent of distant rain and the metallic chill of oncoming trouble. The sky hung low and heavy, painted in muted shades of pewter and ash, the kind of sky that felt like it was holding its breath. A solitary pickup crawled along the narrow mountain road, its engine humming low, while behind the wheel sat a man nearing 50, broad-shouldered but lean, his frame hardened by years of labor and wounds carried long before that. His dark brown hair, brushed with silver at the temples, moved slightly with the draft that slipped through the cracked window. His jaw, sharp and dusted with uneven stubble, was locked tight in thought. The old injury in his knee burned faintly, a reminder of the military past he had never quite escaped. Beside him sat a large husky with a thick silver and white coat, ears high and alert, and eyes like blades of blue ice slicing through the fog. The animal's posture was rigid, sensing something his human companion could not yet name. The man's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he scanned the road ahead, a narrow path carved between stone cliffs and windswept heather. It was the kind of place where silence spoke louder than sound, the kind of place where danger could hide in plain sight. He rounded a bend, and there he was, standing in the middle of the mountain road like a shadow that refused to move, a towering man in his early 50s with a broad, intimidating build. His hair, dark but streaked with gray, was slicked back, revealing a forehead lined with cruelty. A sharp jaw framed by a precisely trimmed beard gave his face the look of a predator evaluating prey. His eyes, cold, black, unfathomably deep, held no warmth, no mercy. The man in the road lifted one hand lazily, signaling the pickup to stop. The driver's stomach tightened. He recognized danger when he saw it. He braked hard, tires skidding slightly on gravel, and stepped out slowly, shielding the husky behind him. The giant figure smirked, hands casually sliding into the pockets of his dark wool coat. "You're a stubborn one," he said, voice as smooth as oil poured over stone. "I've tried being polite. I've tried giving you time, but you just don't listen." The wind gusted, tugging at their coats. The husky growled, the fur along his spine rising like storm waves. The towering man tilted his head, studying the dog. "Strong beast you've got there," he murmured. "Smart eyes, too. Shame. I really do hate wasting potential." The driver stepped forward, muscles tense despite the ache in his knee. "If you've come to threaten me again—" "Oh no," the larger man interrupted, raising a placating hand. "No threats today." His cold smile widened. "Just clarity." He took one deliberate step closer, boots crunching on the gravel. "You sell the land," he said softly, "or that animal disappears first." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They floated in the icy air like a death sentence. The husky lunged forward slightly, restrained only by the man's firm grip on his collar, his teeth bared, a deep guttural growl rolling out like thunder trapped underground. "You stay away from him," the driver snarled, stepping in front of the dog fully now. "Ah!" The larger man's eyes gleamed. "So predictable. You protect him. He protects you. Beautiful, really. Tragic, but beautiful." He left the last words to hang ominously. 3 days, he said finally. "That's all you get." And then, as if the confrontation bored him, he turned and walked to a sleek black car parked just beyond the bend. 2 men leaned against it, one young and wiry with short blonde hair and a smirk that never touched his eyes, the other, older with deep lines etched across his cheeks and a thick neck like a bulldog. Both straightened when their leader approached. The blonde one flicked a cigarette to the ground, smirking at the husky. "Better say goodbye to your mutt," he called back. The older thug cracked his knuckles. 3 days, don't make us come early." The black car roared to life and disappeared down the winding road. The man and his husky stood frozen for a long moment, the world suddenly too quiet. Then the wind picked up again, fierce and biting. The driver crouched down beside the husky, placing a trembling hand on the dog's thick fur. "Not you," he whispered. "I won't let anyone touch you." The husky pressed his forehead against the man's chest, as if promising the same. That evening, the sky turned bruised purple as the man reached the cottage, a small, weathered home nestled in a valley of heather and pine. It had belonged to generations before him, and he carried its weight like a shield and a burden both. He parked the truck and went inside, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Instinctively, the husky followed him, room to room, never straying more than an arm's length away. Inside the dimly lit workshop behind the cottage, The man began pulling out old wooden crates, metal scraps, leftover wire, and rusted tools. He set them carefully on the table, his movements methodical, mechanical, driven by fear disguised as determination. The husky sat by the door, watching quietly, sensing the tension in every breath his human took. The man tested springs, adjusted clamps, measured wire lengths with practiced precision. Though he no longer served, the shadows of military training remained etched into his bones. He built traps, not to injure, but to warn. Alarm lines across the fence, pressure-triggered bells in the garden soil, reinforced locks on every door, a barricade of furniture pushed against the back entrance. With each task, his hands grew steadier, but his mind did not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the towering figure in the road, the cold eyes, the subtle smirk, the promise of violence. 3 days. 3 days until the land would no longer belong to him. 3 days until they came for the husky. 3 days until blood might stain the soil where generations of his family had once lived in peace. Later that night, after the barricades were set and the warnings strung around the property, he sat at the kitchen table. The lamp glowed faintly, illuminating his tired face, lines deeper than most men his age, eyes shadowed with fear and resolve. He pulled out a sheet of stationery and an old pen. His handwriting was rough at first, then steadied. He addressed the letter to a man whose name he had not spoken aloud in years. A man built of square shoulders and iron will. A man who had fought beside him once across continents and deserts. A man he trusted. He folded the letter, sealed it, and stamped it for Morning Post. When he looked up, the husky was staring at him with quiet intensity. "I'm not letting them take you," he whispered again, voice raw. The dog pressed closer, laying his head on the man's knee. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, rattling old shutters and whispering through cracks like a warning. The man rose, walked to the front door, and bolted it. He checked the windows twice, then 3 times. The shadows stretched long across the walls, bending with the flicker of the lamp. He turned and found the husky blocking the hallway, standing guard like a creature carved from northern legends. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured. The husky's tail didn't wag. His blue eyes followed every sound outside the walls. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with fog clinging low to the earth. The man stepped outside to send the letter, the air crisp and unforgiving. As he walked back to the cottage, a chill crawled up his spine. Something was wrong. The chicken coop's gate, closed the previous night, now hung wide open, swinging slowly in the breeze. Tracks led across the damp soil, not animal tracks, heavy boot prints, fresh. The man's pulse hammered in his ears. He followed them cautiously around the side of the cottage, the husky padding silently behind him. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the property, only to start again further away, as though someone had stood there watching the house for a very long time. The man clenched his fists. "They're scouting," he muttered, "testing my nerves." The husky growled low. The man knelt, gripping the dog's collar firmly. "We'll be ready." He rose, staring at the horizon where the footprints disappeared. 3 days. Time was slipping away. But so was fear. Fear was transforming into something sharper, something harder. Resolve. If they wanted a war, they would find one waiting behind every door and window of the old cottage, and they would discover that a man who had lost nearly everything had nothing left to fear, except losing the last companion he still had. That night, as the moon rose pale and breathless above the valley, the man lay awake, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind, every shifting board. The husky lay across the threshold of the bedroom, guarding him, guarding the house, guarding the fragile thread of peace they still held. And somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen but certain, danger watched them back. The battle for the land had not yet begun, but both man and dog knew it was coming, and it would test everything they had left. The night settled over the Yorkshire valley like a shroud woven from storm and shadow. Wind scraped through the heather fields in long, icy breaths that rattled the windows of Thomas Walker's cottage. The clouds hung low, swollen with a promise of freezing rain, and the darkness outside seemed thicker than any night Thomas could remember. It pressed at the walls, at the eaves, as if trying to seep inside, as if it knew something violent and relentless was coming. Thomas stood alone in the living room, lantern dimmed low, listening to the wind howl like a living creature starving for warmth. Frost lay beside him, stretched out but alert, his thick Siberian coat rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. The Husky's blue eyes reflected the faint amber glow of the lantern, and every few seconds they flicked toward the windows, ears twitching at sounds Thomas could not yet hear. Earlier that day, he had sent a coded letter to Sergeant Miller, his old comrade from the Border Patrol Unit, one of the few men he trusted with his life. But help, if it came, would take time. And time was the one thing the night seemed unwilling to give him. Thomas tightened the final knot of rope on a makeshift barrier he had placed across the back door. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His injured knee throbbed with every movement. Yet, he refused to sit, refused to rest. He knew it was coming. He felt it in the marrow of his bones. Frost rose suddenly, not with a bark, not with a whine, but with a stillness so complete it made Thomas's heart lurch. "What is it, lad?" Thomas whispered. Frost stepped toward the door, tail stiff, ears sharp as blades. His low growl rolled through the cottage like distant thunder. Thomas moved to the window, lifting the curtain a fraction. Nothing, no lights, no figures. Just darkness so dense it looked carved from obsidian. And then, the power died. All at once the cottage was swallowed by blackness. The lantern flickered once and died too, leaving the room lit only by the faint silver outline of Frost's eyes. Thomas inhaled sharply. "It's begun." Outside, the wind wailed, slamming the shutters against the wooden walls. The cottage groaned like an old ship in a rising storm. Frost paced in front of the door, claws clicking lightly, but steadily, confidently, across the floorboards. Thomas moved silently to the kitchen drawer, retrieving a long iron wrench, one of the few tools the vandals hadn't destroyed. It felt familiar in his hand, its weight grounding him to reality. A sudden sound cut through the storm. A footstep. No, multiple footsteps. Soft, deliberate, spreading around the perimeter of the house. Thomas's pulse quickened, but his mind sharpened. Years in the army had taught him the rhythm of danger. He counted the shadows shifting, listening to every faint crunch of gravel and damp leaves. 3 men, near the back, 2 near the front, another at the side window, 6 total, and in the midst of them, judging by the way the others hesitated, deferent, stood a 7th presence, the one who gave orders, the one whose shadow had stretched over the valley long before tonight. Graham Doyle. Thomas had never seen him in person, only heard whispers, but he knew the type, a man who had learned early that fear was a currency and cruelty an inheritance. A crackling noise snapped him from his thoughts. The side window shattered inward. Glass rained across the floor like shards of icy rain. Frost lunged toward the noise with a snarl so fierce it seemed to tear open the night. "Frost, hold!" Thomas hissed, but quietly, urgently. Frost froze, muscles coiled, waiting for Thomas's signal. A figure crawled through the broken window. A young man with a bandana pulled over half his face, dark jacket soaked from the storm. His hair was matted blonde, his build slim but tense with reckless bravado. A newcomer, likely a desperate recruit, not one of Graham's seasoned men. Thomas stepped forward, wrench raised. The intruder lifted a metal pipe. They lunged at the same time. The fight was brutal and close. Thomas caught the swing of the pipe with his left arm, pain lancing through muscle and bone, but his momentum carried him forward. He struck the attacker's ribs with the wrench. A crunch, a muffled scream. Frost charged, knocking the man backward and pinning him. Teeth bared centimeters from the man's throat. But before Thomas could command Frost to hold, a booming voice rang from outside. "Leave him!" The voice was deep, gravelly, too calm for the chaos around them. "He's not the one we came for." Thomas knew instantly. Graham Doyle. The man who had never dirtied his own hands. Until tonight. Thomas dragged Frost back before the dog could close his jaws. Frost snarled but obeyed, positioning himself between Thomas and the broken window. A tall silhouette appeared outside in the storm's half-light. Graham stepped into view. He was a man in his early 50s, but the years had aged him like stone rather than a flesh. His height was imposing, well over 6 feet, and his frame was broad but lean, like someone who had once been athletic and still carried remnants of that power. His hair was iron gray, slicked back despite the rain, revealing deep lines etched across his brow. His beard was trimmed to a sharp line along his jaw, peppered with silver, accentuating cheekbones that looked carved rather than grown. His skin was pale, yet hardened by cold climates, and his eyes, dark, almost black, carried a cruel stillness that unnerved even the wind. His expression was unreadable, until it wasn't. His lips curled into a smile, a thin, dead smile. "Thomas Walker," he said, voice almost drowned out by the storm. "You should have sold when you had the chance." Thomas lifted the wrench. Frost lowered into a defensive stance. "Get off my land," Thomas growled. Graham's smile widened. "This isn't about land anymore." He snapped his fingers. The remaining men swarmed through the doors and windows simultaneously. The cottage filled with pounding boots, clashing metal, and the frenzied chorus of the storm outside. One attacker, tall, wiry, with curly black hair plastered to his scalp, swung a heavy club at Thomas. Thomas blocked, but the blow still staggered him. Another man grabbed his ankle, pulling him down onto the wooden floor. Pain shot through Thomas's bad knee. Frost leaped into the fray. The Husky lunged at the man nearest Thomas, his jaws clamping onto the attacker's sleeve. The man screamed, dropping his club, swinging wildly. Frost's teeth bared white in the dark. But then, a third man swung a thick metal baton at Frost's ribs. Crack! Frost yelped, a sound Thomas had never heard from him before, a sound that ripped through Thomas like a blade. "No!" Thomas roared, fury igniting through every nerve. He surged to his feet, wrench raised high, ignoring the spike of agony in his knee. He brought the wrench down on the baton wielder's shoulder. Bone cracked under the force. The man dropped instantly, writhing. Thomas grabbed Frost, dragging him behind him. Frost was breathing hard, limping, his left side trembling. "I've got you, lad," Thomas whispered. But the fight wasn't over. Graham stepped fully into the house now, rain dripping from the shoulders of his dark coat. He reached into his jacket and drew a long hunting knife, a gleaming steel blade with a serrated edge, the handle wrapped in worn black leather. He held it with the ease of a man who had used it often, and without remorse. "You shouldn't have crossed me, Walker," Graham said. "Now you lose everything before the night is over." He lunged. Thomas swung the wrench. Graham dodged effortlessly, striking the wrench aside with the back of his knife hand. Thomas stumbled, just enough. Graham's blade flashed upward, aiming for Thomas's chest. Frost tried to intervene but stumbled, his injured side giving out. Thomas saw the world narrow to the sharp point of the blade. Graham's grin widened, and then a thunderclap sounded from the doorway. Not lightning, gunfire. "Doyle, drop the knife!" Voices filled the air. Boots thundered in. The door burst open as Sergeant Miller and his tactical team stormed the cottage. They moved with precision, each wearing dark tactical gear, flashlights slicing through the darkness. Sergeant Miller led the charge, broad-shouldered, bald, with a thick graying beard and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His presence filled the room like a sudden wall between Thomas and death itself. "Hands where I can see them," Miller barked. Graham turned, snarl twisting his features. But before he could react, one of the officers tackled him from behind, pinning him face first to the floor. The knife skittered across the wood. Graham roared in protest, but his voice was drowned out by commands, handcuffs, and the pounding of boots. The remaining attackers tried to flee, but Miller's team moved too quickly. Within seconds, the room was filled with shouts, the click of cuffs, and the chaotic thrashing of men defeated by a force they could not match. Outside, hail began to hammer the valley, sharp, icy stones cascading from the sky like shards of glass. Inside, the war was over. Thomas dropped to his knees beside Frost, running trembling hands along the dog's injured side. Frost whimpered softly but nudged Thomas's hand with his nose, eyes bright despite the pain. "You're all right," Thomas whispered, tears mixing with the sweat and rain on his face. "You're all right, lad." Sergeant Miller approached, gripping Thomas's shoulder. His voice softened, losing its command edge. "We got your message. Good thing you sent it when you did." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Outside, hail shattered against the cottage roof like applause from the storm. Inside, surrounded by broken glass, fallen men, and the dying echoes of violence, Thomas held Frost close, knowing one truth: tonight, they survived. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the valley like a bruise, dark, aching, and slow to fade. Morning spread gently across the Yorkshire hills, the first thin lines of light breaking through a veil of mist. The air smelled of cedar, wet soil, and the metallic tang left behind after a night of violence. As the sky blushed pale gold, Thomas Walker stood on the cottage porch, exhausted yet upright, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the relief that finally, after years of solitude, grief, and buried battles, he had made it through to dawn. But he was not alone. Inside the cottage, Frost lay curled on a wool blanket near the hearth, the fire crackling softly beside him. The Husky's breath was slow but steady, his chest rising and falling in rhythmic waves. His silver and white coat, usually immaculate and proud, was disheveled from the fight, bearing faint traces of dirt and dried rain. His left side was wrapped in a temporary bandage, placed there by one of the medics who had arrived with Sergeant Miller's team. Even injured, Frost's eyes remained sharp, glacial blue, resilient, unbroken. Thomas approached him, lowering himself onto stiff joints that protested after last night's struggle. He placed a weathered hand on Frost's head, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "You did good, lad," he whispered, voice cracking with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Better than any soldier I ever fought beside." Frost blinked up at him, ears twitching, then nudged Thomas's wrist gently as if to say, "We survived, together." A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. Thomas stood and limped toward the entrance, opening it to find Sergeant Miller on the step. Morning light revealed more of Miller than the chaos of the night before. He was a man in his early 50s, built like a cliff face, broad-shouldered, powerful, with a torso shaped by decades of field work. His thick beard, streaked with gray, framed a face lined with old battles and older regrets. A jagged scar cut diagonally through his left eyebrow, the kind of mark earned from shielding someone else in danger. Beneath his stern exterior, there was a quiet loyalty that made him someone Thomas trusted without hesitation. "You holding up?" Miller asked, his deep voice gentler than usual. "Barely," Thomas admitted. "But we're alive. More than I expected, considering what we found here." Miller's gaze swept the cottage interior, the shattered glass, broken furniture, scorch marks on the walls. Then his eyes softened as they landed on Frost. "He'll need proper treatment. Our medic did what he could, but he needs a vet to confirm the fractures." Thomas nodded. "Already arranged. Margaret offered to drive us. She should be here shortly." Miller huffed a small, approving laugh. "Good woman, that one. She'd make any man rethink living alone out here." Thomas didn't answer, though a shadow of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Miller stepped closer. "Walker, Graham and his crew won't get out of this. We've got enough evidence to bury them twice over. Breaking and entering, aggravated assault, attempted murder, illegal weapons. It's all sticking." The knot in Thomas's chest loosened. "Good." Miller placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now." Two simple words, but Thomas felt them like sunlight breaking open a long winter. By mid-morning, Margaret Hale arrived in her old but well-maintained green Land Rover. She stepped out of the driver's side, wearing a thick wool coat the color of cranberry, her auburn hair tied loosely behind her shoulders. Though fatigue pulled faint shadows beneath her green eyes, she carried herself with calm, poised determination. She had the kind of presence that soothed storms, quiet, steady, reassuring. "Thomas," she greeted softly. "How's Frost?" "He's hurt, but he'll manage. Thanks for coming." "Of course." Margaret knelt beside Frost, brushing a gentle hand along his fur. "You brave boy," she murmured. Frost closed his eyes, leaning subtly into her touch, something he rarely did with strangers. Together, they lifted Frost into the back of the Land Rover. Thomas climbed into the passenger seat, muscles protesting with every movement. As they drove down the winding valley road, morning sun glittered on frost-lined fields, turning everything silver. The world looked peaceful, frighteningly peaceful, compared to the chaos of last night. Margaret broke the silence carefully. "Miller said you fought them off. All of them." Thomas stared through the windshield. "Wasn't just me. Frost saved my life, and Miller got here in time." "That may be true," she said softly, But you stood your ground. That matters. Thomas didn't know how to respond. Praise always sat awkwardly on his shoulders, heavy and undeserved. At the veterinary clinic, a small brick building run by Dr. Harold Keaton, a quiet man in his late 60s with thin white hair and round spectacles, Frost was examined with slow, experienced hands. Dr. Keaton had the soft-spoken patience of someone who had spent a lifetime tending to creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Only a minor fracture, Dr. Keaton concluded. Painful, but he'll heal clean. This dog's built like a wolf, strong heart, strong spirit. Thomas released a breath he felt he'd been holding for 24 hours. Thank God. Frost lifted his head, licking Thomas's hand as if to reassure him. After fitting Frost with a proper support wrap and prescribing medication, Dr. Keaton added, "Give him rest, warmth, and time. Love, too. That dog's loyalty is the only medicine he truly needs." Margaret's eyes shimmered with emotion at the words. They returned home in the early afternoon. The valley had come alive with a quiet bustle. Something unexpected was happening. Villagers, people Thomas had barely spoken to over the past decade, had gathered around the cottage. Men hammered new planks onto the broken windows. Women swept glass from the porch. Children carried small baskets of nails and tools. Even the local stone mason, a burly man named Arthur Yates with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that reached his chest, was there repairing the fence. Thomas stepped out of the Land Rover, stunned. What's all this?" he asked. Arthur straightened, wiping dust from his palms. "Can't let a neighbor rebuild alone, can we?" His voice was gravelly but warm. A woman with silver hair and a braided bun, Mrs. Clara Whitlow, the village baker, approached carrying a basket of warm rolls, her pale blue eyes crinkled with kindness. "We heard what happened, dear. Shame on us for not stepping in sooner. You and your brave dog deserve better from all of us." Another villager chimed in, Michael Trent, a farmer with sun-weathered skin and a thick mustache. "We're starting a small fund for repairs and to honor what you and Frost did last night. We're calling it the Keeper's Fund, because that's what you are, Walker. A keeper of family land, but more than that, a keeper of courage." Thomas felt something loosen inside him, something he didn't recognize at first. Connection, belonging, community. He swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Margaret murmured, standing beside him. She touched his arm lightly. "Just let people help." Frost barked once from the back of the Land Rover, a short, approving sound. The villagers worked throughout the afternoon. Walls were repaired, doors strengthened, broken furniture replaced. Children played with Frost, who tolerated their energy with surprising patience. Thomas moved among them slowly, offering quiet thanks, accepting tools, listening, really listening to their stories for the first time in years. By dusk, the cottage looked whole again, stronger even, and Thomas felt lighter. As evening settled, the villagers departed with warm nods and promises to return with more supplies. Margaret lingered last, helping Thomas carry Frost inside and settle him by the hearth. "You'll be all right now," she said softly. "Because of all of you," Thomas replied. "No." She held his gaze, her green eyes glowing in firelight. "Because of who you are. People don't rally behind someone unless they believe in him." A warmth curled in Thomas's chest. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but it felt good. It felt new. After she left, the cottage grew quiet again. Frost curled beside him, tail wrapped around his paws. Thomas scratched behind the Husky's ears. "We made it, lad," he whispered. Outside, the night was peaceful. No storm, no footsteps, no shadows creeping toward the cottage. Only mist swirling gently across the valley. Thomas stepped onto the porch, folding his arms against the cool air. Frost followed slowly, limping slightly but proud. He lifted his head and released a soft, melodic howl. Less a warning than a song, a hymn of survival. A northern anthem rising into the stillness. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt something he had nearly forgotten. Peace. True. Unbroken peace. And as the mist lifted and dawn began to spill across the Yorkshire hills once more, Thomas smiled. a quiet, grateful smile. "Home," he whispered. "We kept our home." Frost leaned against his leg. Together, the last two guardians of the Walker land watched the valley breathe again. And this time, it breathed without fear. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come as flashes of lightning or voices from the clouds. Sometimes they arrive quietly through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through a weary man who finds the strength to stand again, through neighbors who choose kindness over silence. Thomas and Frost remind us of a truth whispered through Scripture. God does not always stop the storm, but He always sends the strength to stand through it. In the darkest nights, when fear presses close and hope feels distant, He places angels beside us, some with wings we cannot see, and some with fur, blue eyes, and a heart brave enough to fight for us. May this story remind you that no matter how heavy your burdens feel, you are never walking alone. God's hand is closer than your breath, and His protection is stronger than any darkness that surrounds you. If this message touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a reminder of God's quiet miracles. Leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and let us know how God has brought light into your darkest moments. And if you haven't already, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so together we can spread stories of faith, courage, and the love that heals even the deepest wounds. May God bless you, guard your home, and guide your steps today and always. If you believe in His protection, type Amen in the comments.